Hello, everybody. How are you today? We will speak with Patrick Phillips about history. In some of our last videos, we talked about a different outlook on certain historical events.
We did.
They say that the winners of the wars write the history books.
Yeah, and this is true. And it's interesting to me, like with a lot of the students that come through the academy, they weren't born in the 20th century, and a lot of the important points of the 20th century, it's not part of their reality. And they might not even have heard of the main figures of the 20th century, like Martin Luther King Jr. or Kennedy or Gandhi. Um, But yeah, it's true. The winners of the wars do write the history books. And, it was very important for my parents that my brothers and I had a grounding in American history. And they made us watch, well, they let us watch, I'm thankful for that education, many, many documentaries and movies about American history, shows, presentations that are now no longer available. And it gave me an idealistic view of American history. But then also, as you grow older, and hopefully driven by curiosity and an open mind, you realize that not all of it is as it was portrayed to you. A good example of this is the Civil War. Critics of the North in the Civil War are often portrayed as racists or defenders of slavery. A good example of this is Thomas DiLorenzo, a first-rate scholar who's written a couple of books about Lincoln, Lincoln Unmasked, and The Real Lincoln. The winners of the wars do write the history books, and in the case of the Civil War, it's come to be a cult around Lincoln. So questioning his virtue is like heresy.
Okay, so I wonder what you have to say about the World War II.
Yeah, and that's interesting too, from a lot of different angles. You know, over the last 15 years, the post war consensus has become even more rigid, so that if you question the events leading to World War II or you question the motivations, you're accused of being a closet Nazi. Just like there's people who keep their sexual orientations in the closet, not you, of course. And then they have another presentation that they give to the world. That's how they accuse people who write about World War II, but not from the strict rigidity of the post-war consensus. They often say that you're a closet Nazi. Um, but I think we can question certain things about World War II. But it's a weird kind of dichotomy because also over the last 15 years, you've seen uh, normalization and a resurgence of Nazi symbology and Nazi design through Ukraine and these ultra nationalistic groups that are in Ukraine. And these Nazi symbols and Nazi ideology have even made their way into Canada and England, the United States as well. The most dramatic case being when the president of Ukraine, Vladimir Zelensky, went to Canada earlier this year, and I guess it was last year, and he.
I guess it was last year.
Yeah, he had the whole Canadian Parliament honoring an ex-Nazi.
Yeah.
And they just did it without thinking. Um, the way that Ukraine justifies this is saying that those Ukrainians who fought on the side of Hitler, they were fighting against the Soviet Union, and these groups in Ukraine now see Ukraine's war in World War II in isolation from the rest of what was happening in Europe, even though those who collaborated with the Nazis were responsible for killing Jews and all kinds of atrocities. Now these groups in Ukraine refer to World War II as the Ukrainian war against for independence against the Soviet Union. But the Cold War is over. Russia is no longer the Soviet Union, so they have no reason now to maintain this Russia-phobia. But that gets into something that we're going to talk about today, is the unholy alliance between Churchill, Roosevelt, and the Soviet Union, because in some ways the Soviet Union was even worse than the Nazis. And one of the things that motivated Hitler was paranoia about communism. But let's look at the conventional wisdom about World War II. The post-war consensus is that Hitler was crazy and he wanted to take over the world, and his first step was Poland in 1939. When Germany went into Poland in 1939, it was just to attach part of Poland to Germany, part of Poland that was ethnically German, that spoke German, that had been cut off from Germany when the borders of Europe had been redrawn at the end of World War I.
So they were German territories?
They had been German territories. The problem is that then England and France declared war on Germany, and Hitler did not want a war with England. In fact, he let the English escape at the Battle of Dunkirk. He was mostly concerned about the Soviet Union.
And which country was stronger at this time?
Okay, well, the conventional wisdom has it that there was the Axis powers, which were Germany, Italy, and Japan, against the Allied powers, which were England, United States, and the Soviet Union. And other countries helped them, like obviously like Australia and Canada. But the thing is that even looking at it on the face of it, like Poland was the first move to take over the world, let's accept that narrative. It's even not true on the face of it, because the first country that Hitler went into and established a puppet government for was actually Spain in 1936. And he sent, there was a resistance movement because there were those in Spain, obviously, that wanted to be a democracy. They didn't want to have a fascist government. And Germany sent in their air force and carpet bombed the Basque region, killing many civilians, destroying those cities in 1937. In fact, the famous painting Guernica by Pablo Picasso is a portrayal of when the Germans bombed the Basque region. And for the rest of the war, Spain was allied with Italy and Germany against the Allies. And the fascist government in Spain lasted way after World War II, all up in declined in the year I was born in 1975. So they never talk about Spain being the first fascist government that Hitler set up, and that's because it's not convenient.
Yeah,
it's not convenient because of the because we also see parallel in Chile when they set up the dictator Pinochet in Chile when the United States set it up. The idea is, I think we will talk a little bit more about that when we get into the Cold War.
And what was Operation Paperclip?
Yeah, well, at the end of the war, when they were prosecuting the Nazis at Nuremberg, the United States offered immunity to 900 Nazis if they would. They said, we'll hand you over to the Soviet Union, or you can come to the United States and work for us. And some of the worst Nazi butchers and all those Nazis have been doing science and psychological operations. They came and they worked for the United States. They worked for NASA. Some of them were even kicking around during the first Bush administration, and they really went to work on technology and science, and went to work also on terror and repression, like in Latin America.
Okay. This unholy alliance between Churchill and Stalin had deadly consequences for white Russians who had immigrated to Europe.
Yeah, of course, after the Bolshevik Revolution, which Wall Street industrialists
Exactly.
supported, just like the United States supported Fidel Castro with the guns. We are talking about that a couple of weeks ago with the CIA flights
2 weeks ago.
to Fidel Castro. The United States funds both sides of these conflicts, just like they financed Iraq and Iran, both sides when they had their war. So after the Bolshevik Revolution, many Russians immigrated to Europe, and they were the Russians that were turned over to Stalin at the end of World War II. Almost 3 million of them, and they met their certain death. A lot of them committed suicide before they could go, and that was the agreement between Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin. And I mean, almost 3 million Russians, and that's a huge number. That's half of what we're told the Holocaust was. I'm not going to get into how many the Holocaust, but it was officially, they say, it was 6 million. So half of that, there's a lot of people. And we don't hear about that. So this unholy alliance between the United States, England, and the Soviet Union led to deadly consequences for almost 3 million Russians.
Okay, we always saw like the Cold War differently in the past. So how about you? Do you see the Cold War differently now than before?
Yeah, well, I was born kind of during the height of the Cold War in 1975.
Yeah.
And I remember the propaganda very well. And yeah, I do see it differently because during that time, there were countries that didn't want to be aligned with the United States or with the Soviet Union. But the United States considered those countries to be automatically communism. It was like this idea, you're either for us or you're against us. And so a lot of the repression on the part of the U.S. military was aimed at countries that wanted to be politically neutral, like in Central America. And it's interesting too, the Operation Gladio. So Operation Gladio was, and that's now, there have been court cases, there have been investigations, a lot of the documents have been declassified, where the CIA, working with British intelligence, was carrying out terrorist bombings in Western Europe to be blamed on communists. And in Italy and Belgium and different places. In fact, it even resulted in 1978 with the death of the Italian Prime Minister Aldo Moro. And there's a lot that's been written about how that was actually traced to the United States. And so, and also, when you read about the history of Latin America during the Cold War, you realize it had nothing to do with the Soviet Union or even Cuba. But remember, we put in Fidel Castro. We financed the Bolshevik Revolution. That's very well documented. But this was an excuse. And also in the 70s, 60s and 70s, a lot of those that were pro-democracy, they understood democracy with a class analysis in terms of Marxist analysis, and they had political parties that used that kind of language. Just like when the United States was formed, they were drawing on the philosophy that was in the air at the time. But they're really the threat of communism was really exaggerated in places like Guatemala, El Salvador, Nicaragua,
Venezuela,
Chile. Well, Venezuela came later, and Venezuela actually is kind of more like a Cuban model.
okay.
But the thing is that if the people want to have they want to have left-leaning governments, and that's who they vote for, then to establish dictators like Franco in Spain or like Pinochet in Chile, that's subverting the will of the people. And so this is the story of the Cold War that we haven't been told, is the the terror and the repression, which actually continued after the Cold War was over. The United States interventions in Latin America just kept on, like with the bombing of Panama. A lot of the times there's an element of narco trafficking involved, where the U.S. is narco trafficking, like in the case of Panama. So I see the Cold War now totally different.
And finally, Patrick, how did World War II wrap up?
Well, you know, there was these resistance movements in Europe, and the resistance movements had gotten clout through fighting the Nazis, and those people in the resistance movements were poised to win parliamentary elections. And so the United States and England, when they liberated Europe from the Nazis, they just kept fighting the resistance movements, especially in Italy and Greece. There's actually a quote from the general, from one of the American generals, who said that we want to show these resistance movements that for them the war isn't over, because the United States and England wanted to put their puppet governments in Europe. And actually, at one point, I think it was actually sometime later in the 50s and 60s. I don't remember the exact date, but there was a State Department memo that had been drawn up for actually a full-scale U.S. invasion of Italy if the communist parties won through the elections in Italy. But when we were talking about the resistance movements against Nazism, they were communist, but that doesn't matter, because we have to respect the will of the people. And throughout the Cold War, we see a pattern of saying, the U.S. saying, we don't believe in democracy if communist wins. And
Okay, thank you very much.